I always thought betrayal would come with fireworks, some grand, dramatic moment like in the movies. But in real life it's quieter, crueler. It's in the small things you miss until they hit you like a truck. A lingering glance, a secret smile, and, eventually, the cold truth waiting for you behind a door you were never supposed to open. The day started like every other miserable one in recent weeks. Work was a nightmare, thanks to my boss chewing me out for someone else's screw-up. I spent the entire morning biting my tongue and the afternoon counting down the hours until I could escape. By the time I got home, I was already seething. My sister-in-law's car blocked the driveway again, and I had to park 3 houses down. The frustration simmered under my skin as I dragged the trash can to the side gate, wondering why I even bothered coming home anymore. The house was quiet at first, just the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floorboards under my feet. Then I heard voices, my wife Janice and her sister Yuzan in the living room. They were laughing, and for a fleeting second, I thought about how long it had been since I'd seen Janice that happy. A part of me wanted to join them, to forget the stress of work and collapse on the couch with a beer in hand. But something stopped me. I stood in the kitchen doorway, beer already open, frozen in place as their conversation drifted into something far more sinister than I expected. God, he smacked me 3 times today, Janice said, her voice light and playful. Since Brandon came back last month, I just can't get enough of it, she added. I almost dropped the beer. Brandon, her ex-boyfriend, the one who had ghosted her years ago, the one who was supposed to be nothing more than a memory. Except now he wasn't. Now he was back, and apparently they'd picked up right where they left off. I stood there in stunned silence, my heart pounding in my chest. My brain struggled to catch up with what my ears had just processed. Her sister's voice came next. What are you going to do now? He wants me to move in with him, Janice replied casually. So I'll get a lawyer and file for divorce. Under state law, I'll get half of everything. Half of everything. 3 years of marriage, and that's what it came down to for her. Half of everything I'd built. Half of my savings, half of my future. Half of my goddamn life. Taken by someone who hadn't lifted a finger to contribute in years. She hadn't worked a day since our wedding. I paid for everything. The house, the maid, the endless takeout orders because she couldn't be bothered to cook. I slipped out the back door, my mind reeling. I needed air. I needed to get away from that house and that voice before I exploded. I sat in my car, staring blankly at the dashboard, my thoughts spiraling out of control. How had it come to this? How had I not seen it? I ran through the last few months in my head, picking apart every little detail. The coldness in her touch, the way she avoided my eyes, the constant excuses to avoid intimacy. It had all been right in front of me, and I'd been too blind to see it. I thought about confronting her right then and there, storming back inside and demanding answers. But the rational part of my brain kept me in check. No, this wasn't the time. She wasn't even planning to file yet. I had time to think, time to plan. The problem was, I had no idea where to start. I watched from the rearview mirror as my sister-in-law finally left, her car disappearing down the street. My heart was still racing, but now it wasn't just panic. It was something else. Determination. I wasn't going to let Janice take everything from me. Not without a fight. When I finally went back inside, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the dinner I'd cooked the night before. Leftovers were waiting in the fridge, but I couldn't eat. I grabbed another beer and leaned against the counter, thinking through my options. The truth was, Janice had me in a corner. Without a prenuptial agreement, she was entitled to a significant portion of my assets. I'd inherited a large sum from my father when he passed, and even though I'd invested most of it wisely, she could still claim her share. $500,000 gone just like that. I could already hear the arguments she'd make in court. That she'd been a devoted wife, that she'd sacrificed her career to support me. It didn't matter that I'd been the one holding everything together while she sat at home, living off my paycheck. The law wouldn't care. But there was one thing in my favor. She hadn't filed yet. She'd mentioned hiring a lawyer, but that meant nothing had been set in motion. I had time. Janice appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, walking over to kiss me on the cheek. "I didn't even hear you come in." I forced a smile. "Long day at work," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "I didn't have time to cook," she said with a hint of apology. "I was thinking we could just warm up those leftovers." "Sounds good," I said, taking another swig of my beer. She smiled at me. So sweet, so convincing. It was almost enough to make me doubt what I'd heard. Almost. Janice grabbed the container of fried rice from the fridge, heating it up in the microwave while I leaned against the counter, watching her every move. She hummed softly under her breath, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. As she went to take a shower, I stayed behind, formulating a plan. There were too many loose ends to tie up before I made my move. My savings, my accounts, my job. I had to make sure everything was secure before she got the chance to take it. I could feel the clock ticking down. Every second that passed was another moment closer to the inevitable confrontation. But if there was one thing I'd learned from the last few years, it was how to play the long game. And this time, I wasn't going to lose. The house was quiet again. The hum of the refrigerator the only sound as I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open in front of me. Janice was upstairs, soaking in her bath, oblivious to the fact that her entire world was about to change. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation I'd overheard. Every word was etched into my brain like a scar. It wasn't just the affair. It was the audacity, the calculation. She was already planning her life with Brandon, dividing up everything we owned like it was a foregone conclusion. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She tipped her hand too early. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Every instinct screamed at me to act fast. If I waited, I'd lose everything. I needed a plan, and I needed it now. First things first, my finances. I opened my banking app and scrolled through the accounts. Most of my assets were tied up in long-term investments managed by a broker I'd trusted for years. The problem was, liquidating those funds wasn't as easy as clicking a button. There would be penalties, delays, paperwork. I called my broker the next morning. "I need you to sell everything," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind in my head. He hesitated. "Everything? That's a bold move. Are you sure?" "Yes. I need it done by Thursday." He paused for a moment, then agreed. It would take a few days, but by the end of the week, I'd have access to the cash I needed. That was step one. Step two was my job. I'd been with the company for 8 years, working my way up to a senior management position. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid well and offered stability. The problem was, I couldn't just vanish without a trace. I needed a reason, something plausible that would buy me time. I crafted an email to my boss, explaining that a family emergency had come up and I'd need to take a week off. It was vague enough to avoid suspicion, but specific enough to keep him from asking too many questions. By Monday, everything was set in motion. My accounts were being liquidated, my job was on hold, and I'd started packing the essentials. Just 2 suitcases, enough to survive on for a while. Everything else would stay behind. The house was rented, so at least I didn't have to worry about selling it. Most of the furniture was Janice's choice anyway, and I had no sentimental attachment to it. The only things that mattered were the personal items I'd stashed in storage when we first moved in. Things she never cared about and probably forgot existed. I walked through the house one last time, taking it all in. The living room where we'd spent countless nights watching movies. The kitchen where I'd cooked hundreds of meals while Janice sat at the counter, scrolling through her phone. The bedroom we used to share before everything went cold. It should have hurt. It should have felt like I was losing something. But it didn't. Not anymore. On Friday morning, I kissed Janice on the cheek for what I knew would be the last time. "See you in a week," I said, forcing a smile. "Be safe," she replied, her eyes warm and trusting. It was almost impressive how good she was at this. I loaded my suitcases into my Lexus and drove off without looking back. My first stop was Jake's house. Jake was an old friend, one of the few people I trusted unconditionally. When I explained the situation to him, his jaw dropped. "Holy shit," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're really doing this?" "I don't have a choice," I replied. I need to disappear for a while. He nodded slowly, then smiled. I've got just the thing. An hour later, I was driving his beat-up old car, my Lexus hidden safely in his garage. It wasn't much to look at, but that was the point. No one would associate me with it. For the next 4 days I stayed in cheap motels, paying only in cash. I canceled every credit card, shut down every traceable account. The hardest part wasn't the logistics, it was the loneliness. The nights were brutal, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last few months in my head. The signs had been there all along. The sudden change in her behavior, the way she pulled away from me little by little. I'd been too blind, too trusting, too in love to see it for what it was. The memories came flooding back, each one sharper than the last. The day we met, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed. The first time she told me she loved me. Our wedding day. And then the cracks, the arguments, the distance, the nights I spent wondering where it all went wrong. I loved her once. Hell, a part of me still did. But that wasn't enough anymore. By the time I reached Montana, I felt like a ghost. Empty, hollow, barely holding myself together. I found myself in a small roadside diner, nursing a cup of coffee and wondering what the hell I was supposed to do next. An elderly couple sat at the table next to mine, their conversation just loud enough for me to overhear. We just can't afford to hire anyone until the calves are ready for sale, the man said, shaking his head. And even then, it's hard to find someone willing to work for what we can pay. I glanced over at them, an idea forming in my mind. Excuse me, I said, standing up and walking over to their table. I couldn't help but overhear. I might be able to help. The man looked me up and down, his eyes narrowing. We can't pay much, he said. I don't need money, I replied. Just a place to stay. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Let's talk outside. The Montana air hit me like a slap to the face as I followed the man outside. It was cold and clean, nothing like the suffocating heat back in Texas. He walked slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel as he led me to a quiet spot in the parking lot. I noticed the way he carried himself. Strong, deliberate, and cautious. His eyes didn't leave mine for a second. Who are you running from? He asked, crossing his arms. It's not the law, I said quickly, raising my hands in a gesture of surrender. I didn't kill anyone, and I didn't rob a bank. I'm just trying to get away from a bad situation. He didn't respond right away. His face remained unreadable, the lines around his eyes deepening as he studied me. I got the feeling that this man had seen his fair share of trouble and could spot a liar from a mile away. You've got 5 minutes, he said. Convince me why I should trust you. So, I told him everything, or at least the essentials. My name was Paul. I was on the run from an unfaithful wife who wanted to clean me out in the divorce, and I just needed a place to lie low while I figured out my next move. I'll work hard, I promised. I'll earn my keep. You won't have to pay me a cent. I'll provide for myself, and if you decide I'm not worth the trouble, I'll leave without a word. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his gaze flicking over to the diner where his wife was watching us from the window. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said, but I'm warning you, if you're lying to me, or if you bring trouble to my doorstep, you'll regret it. Fair enough, I said. Name's Colin, he added, extending a calloused hand. Welcome to the middle of nowhere. Their farm was a modest operation on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it had a certain charm to it. The house was small but sturdy, with a wraparound porch and an old barn out back. Colin's wife, Beth, greeted me with a warm smile and a steaming cup of coffee. You must be the new farmhand, she said, handing me the cup. Something like that, I replied. Well, you'll sleep in the guest room, Beth said. It's not much, but it's clean. You can start tomorrow morning early. And that was how my new life began. The work was hard, but it felt good, real. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't sitting at a desk or staring at a computer screen. I was outside, breathing fresh air, my muscles aching from honest labor. Colin showed me how to feed the livestock, repair fences, and check the health of the cattle. Beth made sure I was fed and even slipped me a slice of pie now and then, though she insisted she wasn't trying to spoil me. The days blurred together in a steady rhythm. I got up at dawn, worked until my hands were raw, and fell into bed exhausted every night. The nights were quiet and dark, with nothing but the sound of crickets and the occasional coyote howling in the distance. At first, I didn't think about Janice at all. But as the initial rush of my new life wore off, the memories came creeping back. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and replaying everything in my head. The look on her face the last time I saw her. The sound of her laughter when she thought I wasn't listening. The way she made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered until I wasn't. The regret hit me like a freight train, not just for the marriage I'd lost, but for the person I'd become in the process. How had I let it get so far? How had I been so blind? The worst part was the tiny sliver of hope that refused to die, no matter how hard I tried to kill it. The hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a version of this story where everything worked out. Where Janice wasn't a liar, where Brandon had stayed gone, and where we were still happy. But that version didn't exist. It never had. Colin noticed my mood shift before I even said a word. "You've got ghosts," he said one morning, handing me a shovel. "Don't we all?" I replied. He chuckled. "Fair enough. But if you want my advice, there's only one way to deal with them." "And what's that?" "Work them out," he said simply. "Put your head down and keep moving forward. The past will drag you down if you let it. But if you give it enough distance, eventually, it'll leave you alone." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. About a month into my stay, things finally started to feel normal, or as normal as they could be. I'd settled into a routine. Colin and Beth had taken me in like family, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Then, one afternoon, trouble came knocking. Started with a phone call. I was in the barn, mucking out a stall, when I heard Beth calling for me from the house. "Paul!" she shouted. "Phone for you." I frowned. No one knew I was here, no one except Jake. Wiping my hands on my jeans, I headed inside and took the phone from her. "Hello." There was a long pause on the other end. "We know where you are," a voice said finally. It was Janice. Her tone was cold and flat, nothing like the woman I'd once loved. "You didn't think you could just disappear, did you?" My blood turned to ice. "Stay away from me," I said, my voice shaking. "It's over." "It's not over until I say it is," she replied. "You have something that belongs to me, and I'm going to get it back." The line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, my heart racing. Beth watched me with concern, her brow furrowed. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a wrong number." But inside, I knew the truth. Trouble was coming, and it was only a matter of time before it found me. For the next few days, I lived on edge. Every time a car drove by the house, my heart jumped into my throat. Every shadow looked like a threat, every unfamiliar face a potential enemy. Colin noticed the change immediately, though he didn't press me for details. He had that old-school mentality. He'd give you space until you were ready to talk. "You've been jumpier than a cat in a room full of rocking chairs," he said one morning while we were fixing a broken fence. "You expecting trouble?" "Something like that," I admitted, keeping my eyes on the wire I was tightening. "It might catch up with me sooner than I'd hoped." He nodded, the creases around his eyes deepening as he studied me. "Well, just know you're not alone. If something, or someone, comes knocking, we'll handle it together." Those words comforted me more than I expected. By the time Friday rolled around, I was starting to believe I'd been overreacting. Maybe Janice had called just to rattle me, to remind me she still had her claws in my life. Maybe she didn't know where I was after all. Then the knock came. It was late, nearly midnight. I'd been reading in the small bedroom Beth had given me, a cup of tea sitting on the nightstand. The knock was soft at first, almost polite, but something about it felt wrong. I slipped out of bed and moved to the window, peering through the curtain. A black sedan was parked in the driveway, its engine still running. Two figures stood on the porch, one tall and broad, the other shorter, leaning casually against the railing. My stomach dropped. I didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. Brandon. And standing beside him, a woman I hadn't seen in person for weeks, but still knew better than anyone. Janice. Damn it! I whispered under my breath. They hadn't seen me yet. I had a few options. I could stay hidden, hope they'd give up and leave. Or I could confront them and end this once and for all. My pulse raced as I tried to weigh the risks. Colin and Beth were asleep in their bedroom on the other side of the house. I didn't want to drag them into this mess, but I also didn't want to hide like a scared kid. The knocking grew louder. Paul, we know you're in there. Janice's voice called out, her tone sharp and commanding. I clenched my fists. Enough was enough. I grabbed my coat and opened the door, stepping onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a wall, but I barely felt it. My eyes locked on Brandon first, taller, broader, more smug than I remembered. His arm rested protectively around Janice's shoulders, as if staking a claim. What do you want? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Janice smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. We just want to talk, she said. Can we come in?
No.
I crossed my arms. Say what you need to say and then leave. Brandon chuckled. Still playing the tough guy, huh? Thought you'd be smarter by now. Careful, I said, my voice dropping. You're on thin ice. Relax, Janice interrupted, shooting Brandon a warning glance. We're not here to cause trouble. We just need something from you. And what's that? Half of everything, she said, her voice cold and businesslike. You disappeared, emptied our accounts, and left me with nothing. It's only fair that you give me what I'm owed. I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed into the darkness. Fair? You want to talk about fair after everything you did? Her expression didn't change. She'd always been good at keeping her cool under pressure. One of the things I used to admire about her. Now it just pissed me off. I don't owe you anything, I said. You made your choice. You don't get to walk back in and demand a piece of my life. Brandon took a step closer, his jaw tightening. Maybe we should rethink our approach, he said, his voice low and threatening. That was when the porch light flicked on, and Colin appeared behind me, shotgun in hand. Everything okay out here? He asked, his eyes cold and steady. Brandon froze, his bravado evaporating in an instant. We were just leaving, Janice said quickly, grabbing Brandon's arm. Colin didn't move. He just stood there, the barrel of the shotgun pointed at the ground but ready if it needed to be. Smart choice, he said. Next time, don't knock so late. They backed off the porch and hurried to the car, Brandon muttering something under his breath. The engine roared to life, and the sedan sped off down the gravel road, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the cold air. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Thanks, I said finally, turning to Colin. He nodded. I told you, we're in this together. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the empty road. What are you gonna do now? Colin asked, his voice soft. I don't know, I admitted, but as I stared into the darkness, a new thought began to form in my mind. I couldn't keep running forever. If I wanted a real shot at rebuilding my life, I had to confront this head-on. I had to take control of the narrative before Janice and Brandon could twist it to their advantage. I think it's time to fight back, I said, my voice steady. Colin grinned, clapping a hand on my shoulder. About time. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. No more running. No more hiding in the shadows. It was time to fight back, and for once I knew exactly what needed to be done. Colin was already up when I came downstairs, sipping coffee at the kitchen table. Beth was at the stove, humming softly as she cooked breakfast. For a fleeting moment, the warmth of the farmhouse kitchen made everything feel normal, peaceful even. Sleep well? Colin asked, raising an eyebrow. Better than I expected, I replied. Thanks again for last night. Don't mention it, he said. So, what's the plan? I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, my mind already ticking through the possibilities. I need to build a case against them, I said. Something solid. If I can prove what they've done, I might be able to turn the tables before they drag me through the mud. Beth turned from the stove, her brow furrowed. You mean legally? Yeah, I said. But to do that, I need evidence. Bank records, messages, anything that shows how they planned this whole thing. Colin nodded thoughtfully. That's not a bad idea. You've got any contacts back home who can help? Maybe one, I said, thinking of Jake. I called Jake later that morning, explaining everything that had happened since I left. He listened without interrupting, letting me spill every detail, every frustration, every ounce of anger I'd been holding in. Damn, man, he said when I finally paused to catch my breath. They showed up at the farm? These people are relentless. Tell me about it, I muttered. I need your help, Jake. Can you get into my old accounts? I canceled most of them, but there's a chance something slipped through the cracks. I'll see what I can do, he said. But you know they're probably covering their tracks too. If they're as sneaky as you say, they won't leave much behind. I just need one thing, I said. One solid piece of evidence that proves what they've been up to. Got it, Jake replied. Give me a day or two. While Jake worked on digging up digital dirt, I focused on securing my position at the farm. Colin had plenty of work to keep me busy, and honestly, it was the best distraction I could ask for. Fixing fences, moving hay bales, feeding the cattle, it was exhausting, but it kept my mind from spiraling. At night, I helped Beth in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and listening to her stories about life in the small town. It didn't take long for word to spread about what had happened on the porch that night. The next time I went into town to pick up supplies, I noticed the curious glances from the locals. Some nodded politely, others whispered behind their hands. Looks like you've become a bit of a celebrity, Colin joked as we loaded bags of feed into the truck. Great, I said with a sigh. Just what I needed. He chuckled. Don't worry, small-town gossip moves fast, but it dies just as quick. Give it a week, and they'll be on to the next scandal. True to his word, Jake called me 2 days later. I found something, he said, his voice tinged with excitement. Bank records from 2 months ago, right around the time you said Brandon came back into the picture. There are a few transfers that don't make sense. Big ones. They're in Janice's name, but they're going to an account that doesn't belong to her. My pulse quickened. Whose account is it? It's under a business name. Something about consulting services, but I traced it back to Brandon. You're kidding. Wish I was, Jake said. It's all right here in black and white. Looks like she's been funneling money to him for months. A bitter laugh escaped me. Unbelievable. She wasn't just cheating. She was funding his lifestyle. Exactly, Jake said. And that's not all. I found a few messages, too. Looks like she slipped up and didn't delete everything. Nothing explicit, but it's enough to show they were coordinating something. I sat down, my mind racing. This was it, the leverage I needed. Can you send it all to my lawyer? I asked. Already done, Jake replied. He said this changes everything. Thanks, Jake. I owe you one. Just take care of yourself, man, he said. And keep me updated. The next few days were a blur. My lawyer called to confirm the evidence was rock solid. Enough to not only protect my assets but potentially open the door for counterclaims. If Janice and Brandon thought they could walk away with half of everything, they were about to get a very rude awakening. Beth and Colin stood by me every step of the way. They didn't ask for details, but they were there when it mattered. Offering advice, cracking jokes to lighten the mood, and keeping me grounded. It felt strange, leaning on people I'd only known for a few months, but there was something about them that felt like family in a way I hadn't experienced in years. One evening, Colin handed me a beer and nodded toward the sunset. You're tougher than you look, Paul, he said, clinking his bottle against mine. Not many people would have come this far after what you've been through. I didn't think I had it in me, I admitted. But now, I'm starting to believe I can come out of this on top. Damn right you can, he said with a grin. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I allowed myself a rare moment of peace. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was in control again. But I knew the fight wasn't over yet. The real battle was just beginning. The evidence Jake had uncovered gave me power, real, tangible power. For the first time since this nightmare began, the scales were tipping in my favor. The messages, the bank transfers, and the documents tying Brandon to the consulting business all painted a clear picture of what they'd been doing behind my back. But gathering evidence and using it effectively were two very different things. If I wanted this to end for good, I had to play my cards perfectly. One wrong move and Janice could still twist things in her favor. My lawyer, a calm but ruthless man named Richter, explained it with precision. We've got them pinned, but don't go off script. Keep things clean, and this will be over before they know what hit them. Clean isn't exactly how I feel right now, I muttered. Don't worry, he said with a sly smile. We'll clean them out legally. The plan was simple but bold. Confront them directly, with Richter by my side. There'd be no theatrics, no emotional outbursts, just facts and cold, hard leverage. 2 days later, the showdown was set. We arranged a meeting in a neutral space, Richter's office downtown. Janice and Brandon arrived together, their smugness barely hidden under a thin veneer of civility. She looked polished as always, dressed in a sharp blazer, her eyes scanning the room with calculating coolness. Brandon, on the other hand, looked less polished, slightly disheveled, trying to seem relaxed but visibly tense. I sat across from them, keeping my face calm and unreadable, though my heart was hammering in my chest. Richter opened a folder and slid a few sheets of paper across the table. Let's get right to it, he said. We've discovered some interesting financial activity. Janice's eyes flicked to the documents, and for a split second, I saw something crack in her composure. She glanced at Brandon, who leaned forward to read. What is this? Brandon asked, his voice forced and steady. Evidence, Richter replied smoothly. Multiple bank transfers from Mrs. Janice to a consulting account linked directly to you, Brandon. It's all documented. This, along with these messages. He tapped the paper. We can prove that you've been conspiring to funnel money and defraud Mr. Paul here. The air seemed to shift, thick with tension. This is ridiculous, Janice said, her voice low but tight. Those transfers were perfectly legitimate. Stop, I said, cutting her off for the first time. My voice was calm, almost too calm. We both know what you've been doing. Let's not waste time pretending otherwise. Janice's eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw something raw and angry beneath it. So what do you want? She said, folding her arms. I want this over, I said. You walk away with nothing more than what's legally yours, no more, no less. You drop any claims on my savings, and we part ways clean. Or we can go to court, and I can expose everything. Richter leaned back in his chair, waiting, letting my words hang in the air. Brandon smirked. You think you've got us cornered? Court's a gamble for everyone, buddy. True, I said, leaning in slightly. But it's a bigger gamble for you. Once this evidence becomes public, it won't just be a civil matter. Fraud investigations have a way of ruining lives. Janice's face paled slightly at the word fraud. She was smart enough to know exactly what that could mean. Legal fees, investigations, potential criminal charges. Richter tapped his pen on the table. We've already prepared a settlement agreement. All you need to do is sign. He slid another paper across the table. Janice stared at it for a long moment, her fingers trembling slightly before she grabbed the pen. Brandon whispered something to her, but she shook her head. She signed. Smart choice, Richter said, taking the paper and slipping it back into the folder. Now we'll handle the filing. You'll be officially served next week. Brandon stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You'll regret this, he said, glaring at me. Maybe, I replied, standing as well. But at least I'll be free of both of you. They walked out without another word. When the door closed behind them, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Nicely done, Richter said, packing up his briefcase. They'll make noise, but they won't have a leg to stand on now. You won't see them in court. I owe you, I said, shaking his hand. Just send me a postcard when you're living your best life, he said with a chuckle. I walked out of that office into the crisp afternoon air, my head spinning but lighter than it had been in months. For the first time since this mess began, it felt like I could breathe again. That night, back at the farm, Colin and Beth were waiting for me on the porch. Well? Colin asked, raising an eyebrow. It's done, I said, a small smile creeping onto my face. Beth clapped her hands together. Thank God. It's about time you caught a break. Colin handed me a beer and clinked his bottle against mine. You made it through the fire, Paul. Time to start fresh. We sat on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the dark sky. The weight I'd been carrying for so long finally started to lift, replaced by something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. For the first time in a long while, the future seemed wide open, full of possibility. And I was ready to step into it. The days that followed the confrontation felt like a dream, both liberating and surreal. For months, my life had been chaos, every step forward filled with uncertainty and dread. But now, standing on the other side of the storm, I finally felt the calm I'd been chasing for so long. It didn't happen all at once. The freedom came in small, unexpected ways. A full night's sleep without jolting awake in a panic. Walking into town without scanning every face for danger. Even something as simple as drinking coffee on the porch without my phone buzzing with another crisis felt like a gift. Colin and Beth didn't press for details, though I knew they were curious. They gave me the space I needed, watching quietly as I slowly found my footing again. One morning, about a week after the meeting with Janice and Brandon, I got a call from Jake. It's done, he said simply. The settlement's been filed. You're officially free. The words hit me harder than I expected. Free. Seemed so simple, yet it carried so much weight. Thanks, Jake, I said, my voice quieter than usual. You okay? He asked. Yeah, I said after a pause. I think I am. He laughed. Good. Now go live your life, man. You've earned it. That night, I took a long walk around the farm. The sky was clear, the stars shining so brightly it almost felt like they were within reach. The air was cool, carrying the scent of hay and fresh earth. For the first time in months, I felt truly present, grounded in the here and now, rather than lost in the chaos of the past. I thought about everything that had brought me to this point. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the long nights in cheap motels. The way I'd nearly lost myself in the process, drowning in anger and regret. It was hard to reconcile the man I was when this journey started with the person I was becoming. I didn't recognize that version of me anymore, the one who lived for someone else's approval, who believed love could blind him to anything. And maybe that was a good thing. The next day, Beth caught me on the porch with a sly smile. Got a letter for you, she said, handing me a sealed envelope. It was from Richter's office, official confirmation of the settlement and the finalized divorce. It felt heavier than it should have, a physical reminder of everything that had happened. I sat down and opened it, reading the carefully worded legal jargon that essentially boiled down to one thing. It was over. Beth watched me carefully. Good news. The best, I said, folding the letter and tucking it into my pocket. What are you going to do now? She asked, her eyes warm and full of curiosity. I smiled. I guess it's time to figure that out. The idea of a fresh start was intoxicating. For the first time in years, the future wasn't something to fear. It was an open road, full of possibility. I spent the next few weeks helping Colin with the farm, but in the back of my mind, the wheels were already turning. I started making plans, researching small towns where I could settle down, maybe open my own business. The thought of staying in one place again felt strange, but in a good way. Colin noticed, of course. He always did. So, he said one afternoon while we were stacking hay bales, you thinking about moving on? I hesitated. Maybe. I don't know yet. He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Paul. Wherever you end up, you'll do just fine. Thanks, Colin, I said, meaning it more than he knew. One night, as we sat around the fire pit behind the farmhouse, Beth handed me another beer. I'll miss having you around, she said. You've become like family. You'll always be family to me, I replied. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance in the darkness. I thought about how much they'd done for me, offering me shelter when I had nowhere else to go, giving me a place to heal. You saved my life, you know, I said after a while. Beth chuckled. I don't know about that. You did, I insisted. I don't think I would have made it without you and Colin. Colin raised his bottle. To new beginnings, he said. We clinked bottles, the sound ringing out into the night. I didn't leave right away. I gave myself a few more weeks at the farm, soaking up every moment of peace and simplicity. But eventually, I knew it was time. I packed my bags, just like I had months ago when I first left everything behind. This time, though, it felt different. I wasn't running anymore. Beth cried when I hugged her goodbye. Colin just clapped me on the back, his eyes a little misty. You take care of yourself, Paul, he said. I will, I promised. I climbed into my car, the beat-up one Jake had given me, and drove down the long dirt road, the farmhouse disappearing behind me. The highway stretched out in front of me, endless and full of promise. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel afraid. The past was behind me, and for the first time, the future felt like something worth chasing. The road stretched out before me, long and open, the kind of road that makes you feel like it could lead anywhere, like you could just keep driving and leave everything behind. I wasn't entirely sure where I was headed, but for once, that didn't bother me. I hadn't felt that way in a long time. For months, my life had been about survival, escaping, hiding, planning my next move. Now, with everything settled and my past finally behind me, the world felt wide open. The only question left was, what next? I found myself drifting north, passing through small towns that felt like echoes of each other. Diners with hand-painted signs, gas stations where the clerk still knew the regulars by name, main streets that shut down at sundown. Each town had its own charm, but none felt quite right. On the third day, I stumbled into a little town called Ashwood. It was small, tiny, really, the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. But something about it caught my attention. I pulled into a diner on the edge of town and grabbed a seat by the window. The place had that well-worn, lived-in feel that only small-town diners seem to have. Cracked vinyl booths, laminated menus with faded pictures of pancakes, and a waitress who looked like she'd seen it all. "What'll it be?" she asked, chewing gum and tapping her pen on her notepad. "Coffee and whatever your best dish is," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "Best dish, huh? Well, I hope you like meatloaf, 'cause that's what we've got today." Meatloaf it is. As I waited for my food, I watched life unfold outside the window. A group of kids rode their bikes down the street, laughing and chasing each other. An older couple strolled hand in hand, stopping to chat with a man walking his dog. Everything moved at a slower pace here, like time had forgotten this little corner of the world. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside me. Maybe this is what I've been looking for, I thought. After lunch, I wandered down the main street. There was a hardware store, a bakery, a used bookstore tucked between them. Most of the businesses had been there for decades, judging by the hand-painted signs and the photos in their windows. I turned a corner and found myself standing in front of a small building with a "For Lease" sign in the window. The paint was peeling and the windows were dusty, but the place had potential. A woman watering flowers next door noticed me and waved. "You thinking about renting that old place?" she called out. "Maybe," I said, stepping closer. "What was it before?" "Oh, it's been a few things over the years. A bakery, a general store, even an art studio once. But it's been empty for a while now." I looked through the window. The interior was bare, but my mind was already filling with possibilities. "What do you think this town needs?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "We could always use a good cafe. Somewhere people can sit, have a cup of coffee, and catch up. That night, back at the small motel where I was staying, I couldn't stop thinking about that building. I wasn't a business expert, but I'd always loved coffee shops. The smell of fresh beans, the quiet hum of conversation, the way they brought people together. Maybe it was crazy. Maybe it was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I called the number on the for lease sign. By the end of the week, I had the keys in my hand. The building needed work. Lots of it, but I didn't mind. I threw myself into the project, just like I'd thrown myself into farm work back at Colin and Beth's. The physical labor felt good, almost therapeutic. I spent my days scrubbing floors, painting walls, and installing counters. At night, I sketched out the menu and dreamed about what the place could be. The townspeople were curious at first, then supportive. Some stopped by to offer advice. Others brought coffee mugs they'd collected over the years, insisting I should use them in the cafe. "You're part of the community now," the woman from next door said one day, bringing me a plate of cookies. By the time opening day arrived, I wasn't sure what to expect. I'd printed some flyers and passed them around town, but I had no idea if anyone would actually show up. At 7 a.m., I unlocked the door and waited. The first customer arrived 5 minutes later, a retired teacher who lived down the street. Then came a young couple with their toddler, followed by a group of teenagers on their way to school. By 9 a.m., the place was packed. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and conversation. I stood behind the counter, watching it all unfold, and felt a swell of pride. This was mine. I'd built it from the ground up, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That night, after the last customer left, I locked the door and stood in the quiet cafe. The tables were empty, but the air still hummed with energy. I thought about everything that had brought me here. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the long nights spent wondering if I'd ever find my way again. Felt like a lifetime ago. I wasn't the same person I'd been when this journey started. I'd been broken, sure, but I'd put myself back together piece by piece. And now, standing in the glow of my cafe's lights, I realized something I hadn't thought possible. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. The days turned into weeks, and the cafe quickly became a central part of the town. It wasn't just a business. It was a meeting place, a spot where people came together to share stories, celebrate small victories, or just escape the world for a little while. Every day brought something new, and every face that walked through the door became a part of the growing tapestry of my life. At first, I couldn't believe how much had changed. Not just the cafe, but me. The man who opened the doors each morning was almost unrecognizable from the one who'd left everything behind months earlier. I'd learned how to let go. Not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece. The anger, the resentment, even the regret. I let them fall away like dead leaves in the wind. In their place, something new had taken root. Peace. One afternoon, Jake called me out of the blue. "Paul, man, I've been thinking about you. How's the new life?" I leaned back in my chair, smiling. "Pretty damn good. I've got a little cafe in this sleepy town, and life's finally calm for once." "A café? You? Never thought I'd see the day." He laughed. "I'm happy for you, man. You deserve it." "Thanks," I said. "I owe a lot of it to you. If you hadn't helped, I don't know where I'd be right now." "You would have figured it out," Jake replied. "You're stronger than you think." That night, I sat on the back patio of my apartment above the cafe, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. A breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers from the planter boxes I'd set up, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to look back. Not with pain, but with clarity. I thought about Janice and Brandon. I wondered where they were now, how they were getting by. Maybe they'd managed to rebuild their lives, too. A part of me hoped they had, even if I'd never forgive them. Carrying that bitterness would only weigh me down, and I had no interest in dragging my past into this new chapter of my life. People come into your life for a reason, I realized. Sometimes they're meant to stay forever. Other times they're only passing through, leaving marks on your heart that take time to heal. Janice had been a hurricane that swept through my life, tearing everything apart. But that destruction had forced me to rebuild, and in doing so, I'd created something better than I ever thought possible. A few months later, Beth and Colin came to visit. They showed up unannounced one afternoon, grinning from ear to ear as they walked through the cafe's front door. "Well, look at this place," Beth said, hugging me tight. "It's perfect. Not bad for a farmhand," Colin added with a wink. I gave them the grand tour, beaming like a proud parent as I showed off the cafe's cozy nooks and handmade tables. We sat by the window, drinking coffee and catching up on everything that had happened since I left the farm. "You've really built something special here," Beth said, her eyes sparkling. "We always knew you had it in you. Couldn't have done it without you," I said. "You gave me a place to land when I needed it most." "That's what family's for," Colin replied. That night, after they left, I stood in front of the cafe and looked up at the sign hanging over the door. It was simple, just the name I'd chosen when I first opened, Full Circle Cafe. At the time, it had felt like a clever nod to starting fresh. Now, it felt like something deeper, a reminder that life has a way of bringing you right back to where you're meant to be. One evening, just before closing, an older man came in with his granddaughter. He ordered a cup of coffee, and she picked out a cookie from the glass case at the counter. They sat at the corner table, laughing quietly, and for a moment, I found myself smiling. It reminded me of something my dad once said to me, back when I was just a kid. "Life will knock you down sometimes, but if you're lucky, you'll always find your way back to the things that matter most." I hadn't understood it back then, but now, standing in the glow of the cafe's soft lights, I finally did. I wiped down the counter, flipped the open sign to closed, and locked the door behind me. The street was quiet, bathed in the warm light of the lampposts. I stood there for a while, breathing in the night air and letting it all sink in. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for once that didn't scare me, because I wasn't running anymore. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The end.